Welcome back to another episode of Preacher in the Hat. As you can see, if you're watching on video, that Derek is in the shot with me. And if you're familiar with the show, you know what that means. That means we have a guest in studio. Yeah, so I was wondering if everybody would put a hand together for Mr. Jeff Shelnutt.
Woo! Yeah, baby! Yeah! Woo-hoo! All the way from Macon, Mississippi.
So, super friend of the show, Jeff. We appreciate all that you've done to support us as we got started. And that is not, of course, not the only reason to have you on the show, is because we've got a lot of stuff that we want to hear from you. But welcome. And this time, with this welcome, we'll allow you actually to respond verbally as opposed to like deafening applause.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I enjoy the show, and so it's just an honor to be on with you guys. Yeah. Looking forward to this time.
We're happy to have you. So, Jeff, one of the main reasons we brought you in, of course, you know this, but this is more for everyone else, is that we have had the honor and pleasure over the years, based off of where we go to church here in Birmingham at Grace and Truth, to hear a lot of stuff about what you have been able to do on the mission field, both stateside and internationally. Mm-hmm. So it is high time for Preacher in the Hat to
go global.
Go global.
Oh,
exactly.
Yeah, baby.
Exactly. To see. To get that story out. Not that it's not already out in a bunch of places, but well, to be frank, Jeff, we want our turn. So we're really happy to have you here. Is there anything you want to you might want to kick in as we get rolling?
Let's do it real quick.
I figured.
In 2007, if I remember correctly, two young men came to Grace and Truth Church on a Sunday morning that I didn't know. And they were there and worshiped with us. And then at the end, I noticed that they went immediately to their car and took off to their car. And just like Chris Sumter does every Sunday, you know. But anyhow, they were probably just as quick or quicker than him. But I chased them to their car and said, I want to meet you guys. And so we shook hands, greeted each other, found out they were back from Belize.
That's right.
At that time. I had been missionaries in Belize for a while, several years. I think you said maybe you started in 2000 sometime. So we've been years for a while. And you had returned from Belize. And so I said, why don't we have lunch together? And we had a cafe called Kairos Cafe at that time at Grace and Truth. And we did. And it's been together. We've been together ever since. So that's Mr. Patrick Evans, who has been your leader at times. Initially, he was, and and yourself formed Dayspring Mission, and you've been in Belize, and you've been in Nigeria, and you've been in Macon, Mississippi, and Birmingham, Alabama, and all over the place. So we don't have to go in any particular order, and whatever you guys would like to do, we'll go from there.
I need to know, though, I need to go back to that, though, first, because if you've ever been around Birmingham, like, Grace and Truth doesn't just, like, pop off the page.
That's really good question.
So,
good comment.
And you guys like you said, you were just back from Belize. How did you end up there?
Oh, good question.
That's a great question. I had heard of Grace and Truth, and that was before we went to Belize, which Patrick and I started working together as Dayspring Mission in 2000, and so we were in Belize until 2007. And I'd previously heard of Grace and Truth, and I'd heard that it was a Mennonite church, at least at the time.
Yes.
And that was interesting because there's not many of those around in Birmingham.
Right.
And that morning, I think we had maybe a previous engagement at a church that had fallen through. Something had happened, and we were free to go and just find a church of our choice. And so we said, hey, let's try to find, well, first of all, let me back up. We had heard also there's a Quaker church.
Yes, I remember that.
And we thought, never been to a Quaker church before. This should be interesting. We couldn't find the Quaker church.
On South Side. It was somewhere on South Side.
Somewhere. I don't think the address matched where we were looking anyhow. And as we were looking, we drove by Grace and Truth and saw the sign, and we said, well, how about that? We've talked about popping in there before. Here it is. And so we went inside. The service had already started, I believe, maybe. maybe you guys are wrapping up the last song, and
Okay.
you're getting ready to preach.
Rest
And
is history.
the rest is history.
And it was not Mennonite.
It was not.
It was no longer Mennonite.
That's happened to a couple other people.
That's right.
And we were like, this is not what we expected. We didn't know what to expect,
Yeah.
but it's not this. But it was
Because
good.
you knew some Mennonites in Belize.
We
too,
did.
So you had some connection
Sure
there.
did.
Ah, okay.
Actually, in Belize, we knew various kinds of Mennonites, but there is a Russian Mennonite community, which is old order Mennonites, more like the Amish, for people that might be more familiar with the Amish. And that kind of plays into more of the story of Belize, but
Yeah.
but they lived very primitively, and they used horses and buggies, and we had gotten to know the community, some people in the community through our various travels in Belize. So I don't know if we were expecting that from Grace and Truth, but it certainly wasn't that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So so in Belize, you actually were among a group of Mayan Indians. Am I right? The village you lived in. Tell us about that a little bit.
We lived in a Mayan Indian village right near the Guatemalan border, and it was a population of about 1,000 people, and then it was centrally located, so within probably a 5-mile radius, there were other Mayan Indian villages, and so that was the area we felt led to settle in, and primarily at that time because that was an area of Belize that had the least amount of mission work. So a lot of mission teams had gone to Belize over the years because of its close proximity to the U.S., but not many groups had made it that far into the area that we were.
And so, to give people a little bit more context, you kind of mentioned at least a little bit already. So, at least internationally, you were in Belize from when to when?
Belize from 2000 to 2007.
Okay, and your other international stops?
In Nigeria from 2007 to 2016.
Okay. All right. So I just want to make sure, give people a little idea of the time frame that we're talking about. So that's really cool. I did have a question to get a little bit more random on you. And first, before I forget, my producer will pop me upside the head if I forget this after the show. Great hat. Thank you for great choice. Probably one of the best visitor hats that we've had. So,
Well, the bar had been set high, so I
yes.
wanted to make sure
So
that I could
top
try
shelf,
to
top shelf
fulfill
quality there.
expectations.
Secondly, obviously being in countries like Belize and then Nigeria, what is the most exotic pet you that was kept around? So not necessarily maybe the most the most wild animal you've seen, but like the one that was like kind of in your circle, if you will.
You would think I would say a monkey or a baboon, because
Well, those would certainly qualify as wow, but you're apparently going to go beyond
they
that.
were pets and they were exotic, and unfortunately, the name of this animal is not coming to me. It's like the West African version of a armadillo, except more armored. It looks like
More armor.
looks like
Like a Brinks truck, basically. Like a mini Brinks truck,
They can
basically.
roll into a ball. It's like a space alien.
Really?
And we had a few of those over the years.
And like temperament, what were they doing?
Very
What were they-
docile.
Oh, really? Okay.
Moved very slow.
Hence the armor, I guess.
They had to protect themselves.
They're
so
slow.
they
Yeah,
weren't running
right.
away.
A lot faster things. Yeah.
that's
So which
interesting.
country was that?
That was in Nigeria.
Okay.
So, baboon, right? I mean, they'll like,
Yeah. All right.
they'll like rip your face off, won't they? Like, aren't they kind of? I mean, obviously this one didn't, but
These
what
didn't.
was these can what
Yeah.
what was the story?
In the village that we lived in Nigeria, jumping from Belize to Nigeria here, the villagers hunted monkeys and baboons. They were very prevalent. They hunted them for meat, and there was no hunting season. There were no regulations, and so they would actually kill mother baboons that still had babies that were nursing or on their backs, and they would sometimes just leave the baby, or they'd bring it back to the village. And so the first baboon that we received was because somebody had killed the mother, brought the baby, and said, "Would you like to buy it?" And I think we paid maybe $5 for it, which was a good deal for them and a good deal for us as
Yeah,
well.
right.
And that was the first baboon, and her name was Edna. And so over the years, we had more baboons brought to us and some monkeys as well, and it was all the same situation. We were basically running a rescue along with the ministry just to help the animals out, because otherwise they wouldn't have had a chance.
Wow.
Interesting.
Crazy.
That's
and like
amazing.
the baboons were like, they were pretty cool with you guys, or they're
Because they started out so young with us,
okay.
they were.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And the males, as they got older, they get a little more aggressive, so we did have to be a little bit careful. But it definitely was different than if we had gotten an adult baboon. That would have been more difficult.
Yeah,
He's got his face.
It's
Yeah.
looking.
Yeah.
It looks clean.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's
So
a
this is
bit-
my
good.
original
Scratches.
This
face.
is the original one.
Original
real
face.
thing. This is Jeff 1.0.
So let's find out, since we jumped to Nigeria.
Yeah, that was my
little
my
bit-
bad
a little-
completely.
It's okay. Talk about the village where you were in Nigeria. Now, I know you had in the city. You had a house. I know that from past stories, but you actually were in a village way out, very distant. In both settings, you were very rural. Am I right?
That's
But
correct.
tell a little bit about the Nigeria setting.
Sure. The village in Nigeria was even more remote than where we lived in Belize. I would say in Belize we were about an hour and a half driving from town. I think it was about a 30-mile drive. In Nigeria, we were 4 hours from the nearest city. And it was only about a 90-mile drive, if I remember correctly, but it would take us
90 miles take 4 hours.
It would take us 4 hours. Yep. And
So definitely
12
some
miles
interesting
would-
terrain.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
12 of those miles, the last 12 miles into the village would take us about 2 hours. And sometimes the road would be so bad that we'd have to actually get out and work on it. We'd have tools that we kept with the Land Rover that we would pull them down and have to work on the road just to be able to pass, depending on the time of year. But it was a very remote area, and that's one of the reasons that we were attracted to it, was because it had very little mission work in that area in the past. Very few missionaries had been to that area, and none had lived back there before. And so that gave us the opportunity to reach out to a completely unreached people group, the Fulani, which is the largest unreached people group in all of Africa, and then also the local tribe, which was the missionary, and they were a partially reached people group. So had a little bit of knowledge of the gospel, but it hadn't really taken root in their midst.
Gotcha. Now, you actually learned the language in Nigeria. Is that true in Belize as well?
Thankfully, Belize is a former British colony, so the official language is English, and a lot of people spoke it. We could get away with English.
I got you.
Well, for that matter, Nigeria also used to be a British colony, but in the area that we were, once you get out away from the city, not many people speak English. And so I learned Hausa, which is the major trade language of northern Nigeria. Gotcha. Basically, it's if you know English, then you can go to a lot of places in the world and you can communicate with a lot of people. If you know Hausa in Nigeria, there are over 600 tribes that all have their own language, but if you know Hausa, you can probably talk to half of them. So it's a good lingua franca to learn.
And you also had people that were nomadic and came through your village, not just the people that lived there. Am I right?
That's correct.
Or there would be nomadic tribes that came close to your village on their paths to somewhere.
That's right. That was the Fulani, the unreached people group. They are largely nomadic, and they would travel all over Nigeria with their cattle. Just depending on the time of year, they were looking for the greenest grass. They would follow the rain, so to speak. And we had a major trade route that ran about 100 yards in front of our mission station. And so we'd have thousands of Fulani that would pass every year.
And this was a mission statement that you and Patrick built.
That's right.
It was not there when you came.
We lived in a tent for 8 months while we got the villagers to help us make mud blocks and dried those in the sun. And then we built a house out of those blocks and eventually built a barn and just kind of grew it up from there. So yeah, it was totally from the ground up.
I think that's a big part that a lot of people who have not done like actual like mission work out in the field like you guys did is that we think of, I think of the verse, go into the world and, share the gospel. That's a paraphrase, but and you think like you just go and you're just boom, you're there and you're sharing the gospel. But there's so much, I'm imagining, legwork at the front, particularly. And you can maybe even compare some of this for us, like Belize versus Nigeria, like how much lead up time and what all you had to do to get ready before you were like, how long was it before you were actually like, okay, we've earned trust, we can share the gospel with these people. And
Great
we've
question.
built up homes. We've built up our home. We've built up our thing. Like, because you kind of,
in your mind, you're like, oh, you get there and boom, you share the gospel. But it doesn't seem like that would really be workable.
Belize was a little easier in that regard because we didn't have the language barrier as much.
Yeah.
But we probably spent in Belize 2 or 3 years living in the village. And we can talk more about this. We actually drove a school bus down to Belize.
School bus, a converted school bus. You drove it from Birmingham?
We did. Through Mexico to Belize. And that was a bus we spent, I think, 8 or 9 months converting into an RV for that purpose, to drive to Belize.
Yeah.
And parked it in the village where we lived. And once it was parked, it was parked. We didn't use it for transportation anymore, but it was our home. And after we had the bus established in the village where we lived, we also built a thatched roof house, the same type of house that the Mayans lived in, and used that as our teaching facility. But I would say it was 2 or 3 years before we, I think, earned enough trust to where people began to open up to us and began to realize, hey, these guys are here to stay. We were doing a lot of work with the children in the village, a lot of children's ministry, and then that helped definitely to open doors into the adults' hearts. But in terms of Nigeria, that took even longer because there was the language barrier. And then there was going into an area where some of the people had never seen a white person or an American, and certainly never had a relationship with them. And so that was a much longer task. I remember telling you, Steve, probably the first 3 or 4 years, we felt like we spent about 70 or 80% of our time just surviving. Whether it was initially building the mission station or then just, doing something like washing clothes, which of course had to be done by hand and had to be done from water from a well that we dug ourselves. And so you have all these time-consuming chores, and you're like, when are we going to get to do ministry? Because we're just trying to live here. And that did come eventually, but it was a long process.
And then also you did some medical work.
We did, which was a huge step towards building people's confidence in us and what we were there to do. We quickly discovered that there was no medical care in the area. The nearest hospital was probably 30 miles, and to get there, part of that was having to walk up a mountain and then catch several taxis, and then even getting to the hospital might not could afford the care, or the person might be from the wrong tribe and they might not get treated as quickly or as efficiently. So we basically took our rudimentary first aid skills and began just helping people out with wounds, with infections. And the more people we helped, the more people started coming. And then we were able to procure some medication, some pharmaceuticals from the city where we resupplied. And you see the same 10 or 12 tropical diseases over and over, and you learn how to treat them. And probably within a year, we were having people from a 50-mile radius that was coming to our clinic.
So would you get, like, even for the medical clinic especially, would word even travel, like, through the nomadic group? Like, so would you have people, so you would just have people come looking for you guys?
Definitely.
Yeah.
We would have people that were passing that had seen our house before, but then the next time they came through, they had heard, hey, we can get medicine here.
Yeah.
So they would be stopping, and then we'd have people that had heard from people that had passed that would come walking through the bush, come 3 or 4 on a motorcycle through the bush, riding bikes sometimes, and sometimes showing up the night before we'd have clinic. And so they would just, find a house in the village to sleep in and wait till we opened the doors the next morning. But we definitely had, the word spread very quickly.
I imagine that was that sort of thing for those people was such a huge deal, because you can please correct me if I'm wrong, I would assume that a lot of things that you guys treated were probably things that if it were happening here, it would not be much of a problem to treat. But for them, if it prolongs, it's something that would easily get out of control for them.
Definitely. Yeah, just basic infections.
Right.
That go untreatable because there's no access to antibiotics. And so a lot of what we were doing was just treating infections. And some people had carried, these stomach issues for years, or, whatever it might be. Dysentery was big. Even something like hepatitis, because of the unsanitary conditions, people remained untreated for a long time. They had very robust immune systems because of growing up in that environment, but just felt bad all the time. And so a lot of times it was just a matter of, getting them on the right antibiotic and getting them some vitamins and kind of coaching them about diet and some lifestyle choices. And that did it.
That's crazy. Here's the part. This is what would strike fear in the heart of me if I was helping in a medical station. Were you guys ever involved in assisting with a childbirth?
Thankfully, no.
Okay, good. I'm glad for you. I would be, if somebody came to me like that, I'd be like, oh, I know like they were obviously, women were giving birth long before you guys showed up. So that's not one of the, that wasn't something they were necessarily coming for help for, but I was just curious if that.
I was prepared. I tried to be prepared for it as much as I could, but because there were midwives in the village, that is something they took care of.
I figured, they obviously had more experience. Yeah, they've kept that going for a while. But
and we also realized that if we did that one time, we'd probably end up delivering a whole generation of babies.
I was gonna say,
kind of good it didn't go in that direction.
That's right. You probably would.
So would you say that on the mission field, especially where you have those kind of barriers, language barriers especially, medical, like basic medical help, is that your number one trust builder?
In our area, I would say so.
Okay.
And we didn't realize that. That was just the grace of God that we were led in that direction.
That was my next question, is if you were coached on that. Yeah.
We had no intention of going in the medical direction. It was the need that was there, and it was what God used to bring people literally to our front doorstep that never would have come otherwise. Mm-hmm. And it was just an incredible opportunity because we would have sometimes 20 or 30 people lined up in front of our house at 6 o'clock in the morning. We opened the doors at 7. And I would just go down there with a house of Bible and read a passage of Scripture, and just usually from the Gospels, and just share with them about Jesus. Sometimes it'd be 80 or 90% of these people that were waiting would be Muslims. And so in many cases had never heard the gospel before. And I can't think of anything else that would have brought people to our home and would have brought them with open hearts than doing what we're doing in terms of the medicine.
And not just brought them there, but to actually listen to what you had to say. Yeah.
Because if they left, they didn't get the medicine. And so
right.
but then when they started feeling better, they were grateful. They told their friends, and even if there was an aversion to hearing about Jesus, they still came.
Did you get much hostile reaction at all? If you did that at all, I bet you didn't.
I never got any.
I never heard about it.
Never received any hostility from sharing the gospel with any Muslims that came to our medical clinic. Yeah. Now, sometimes you get people that didn't seem like they wanted to be listening, but they were always polite.
Yeah, right.
And they would hear me out. So
probably contrary to the way it would be in the United States.
Yeah, very different.
A little more resistance.
As in polite,
Sure.
That kind of thing. So, yeah, so really, and in Belize, you didn't do as much medical stuff there, but you did education stuff a lot with the kids. Am I right about that?
That's right. And
so that was like the education was an open door.
Yep.
In Belize, the medical stuff was an open door in Nigeria. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's correct.
That's what I remember, but I'm just checking.
You're right. In Belize, we did see a lot of machete wounds. That was kind of that was the tool of choice for the Mayan Indian. They would use them for building their houses. They would use them for going to the farm, for clearing land, and they would use them accidentally to cut themselves. And so we got a lot of machete wounds. Thankfully, they were very straight and usually easy to clean. And we didn't do sutures in Belize, but we got very good at using duct tape for closing up wounds.
Oh, I was about to say, who was the stitch guy? But you used
in Belize we use duct tape.
Okay,
and you can cut them like
and
butterflies.
And that works out pretty well
if you keep them on and keep them dry.
Interesting.
It closes up the wounds well.
What's quite interesting is, Jeff, is that you didn't go there with medical stuff. That just kind of was a need where you had to meet it. You could do it. You were allowed to legally and otherwise in that country. But you were not skilled or trained that much in it. You actually learned a lot, got a lot of on-the-job education related to medical stuff. And now since you're back in the States, you're now a trained paramedic.
EMT.
EMT, I'm sorry. Yeah, right. So, which is kind of interesting. It's like you did it for years, and now you had to come to the United States to be trained.
Got the training on the back end.
Yeah.
We were practicing medicine in Nigeria.
Yeah.
Got fairly
Without a
efficient
medical
at it.
license.
That's right. Don't tell anybody.
I mean, I would assume that you were probably providing better care than some other places in the country. I would say there's probably no doubt about that.
I think part of it was the access to the medication that we had.
Yeah.
Also, we sold the medication at a very subsidized price. It was just basically our cost, and so they could get what they needed, medicine that worked, and they could get it at a cost that they could afford, and so that definitely helped out as well. But to your question about Belize, as far as a different open door, when we first arrived in the village in Belize, we realized that there were several churches, and all of them, as churches are apt to do, had programs for adults, but none of them had any programs for children. There were no Sunday school classes, no vacation Bible schools, nothing like that. And so we didn't necessarily go there with this intention, but that was the opportunity before us, and we opened up our doors, and every Sunday afternoon we'd have 70 or 80 children that would come and have Bible school at our house.
Wow.
And so during the time that we were in Belize, we were able to, I think we taught through the entire Bible 3.5 times with these same 70 or 80 children that were growing up, right before us. And that was opening doors for us to go into their parents' homes and build relationships with them as well. So
Now, something that you had said, I want to go back to something you actually said off camera here. So before we even started, now 2000 to 2007, right? Those were your Belize years.
That's right.
You were just telling us about one of your students, or one or two of your students, some things that you had heard recently here now.
very encouraging. Yep. We had one young man who, when we had to leave the village, which is another story, he had come to us, and I think it was we ended up having a high school in the village that kind of grew out of our children's program. And so when we ended up leaving Belize, this one young man who had been with us probably since he was 5 or 6 years old and had come all the way up through our school just came to us in tears. And he was somebody that I'd had a lot of conversations with, but he never really expressed much interest in terms of following Jesus or making a firm commitment. But I guess it was the fact that we were leaving, and all of a sudden kind of his world was being shaken up a little bit and things were turned upside down for him. The Lord just used that to bring him to a point where he wanted to receive Christ on our front steps. And as I say, I think that was one of our last days in the village. And it was one of the young men that you're thinking maybe cynically that of everybody that we're working with, I'm not sure that he's going to that he's going to be the one that the Lord's going to get a hold of. But that's just me doubting God, and I shouldn't do that. But fast forward 15 years after we left Belize, gone to Nigeria, come back to the States, we're in Mississippi. We reconnect with this young man who's no longer a young man on Facebook, and find out that he is church planting. He's married and he's church planting in Minnesota. And so somehow he had made his way to the States. Whoa. He was doing construction work, and then he was also pastoring, and came and visited us a couple years ago, and we were able to catch up with the first time we'd seen him since leaving Belize, and just to see what the Lord had done, bringing him even further north.
Belize to Minnesota was his parka like a couple meters thick, probably when he
talk about worlds
Man.
apart. Yeah. And then there was another young man recently too you've heard about.
That's right. Another young man that was one of our students in Belize. He had gone on to join the military in Belize and had begun living a life that was far away from the Lord. And at one point, he had been drinking. He was out walking late at night, and he had got hit by a car. Broke his leg, ended up in the hospital, and that was the moment that the Lord got his attention as well. And so he's another one that we reconnected with on Facebook, and he's actually training to be a pastor at this point. And occasionally I'll see his Facebook reels go by, and he'll be preaching, and that's just very encouraging to see years later what the Lord is doing in these now
And
men's lives.
He's still in Belize?
He is.
Okay.
And another student that I believe too is also doing some pastoral training. So that's 3 that we worked with directly.
That's awesome. It's like 17 years later, plus whatever the work is is still continuing. That's
Still
that's
continuing.
just awesome to see. Yeah. So if it's a possible story to share, because you kind of brushed by it there, what initiated the move from Belize to Nigeria?
When we first went to Belize, we had to enter into an agreement with the village where we lived that they would give us 5 years and then reassess what we had done since we had been there. And a lot of that was just mistrust of foreigners, and in some ways rightly so. Some people from America had come into the area and bought up some land, and that was encroaching on land that they were farming, and so they wanted to make sure that what we're doing is what we say that we're going to do. And that was about 2 years into our stay there when that agreement was made. So that's 2 + 5, 7 years rolls around, and the end of our agreement is coming up, and the men are coming together to vote, and the vote ended up going against us. And we don't know all the reasons for that. We'd been working with most of these men's children for a long time. I think that part of it might have been a strong Roman Catholic faction in the village that had gotten to the local government. And of course, we're evangelical missionaries, and so there's a little bit of tension there. Again, we don't know all the reasons other than the Lord orchestrating it, but we ended up having to make a decision. Were we going to try to really fight to stay and spend time pointing out, saying, hey, we've done this for you. We've been here. We've fulfilled our end of the obligation, and point out all the benefits that we felt we had been to the people, or just see this as a door closing and another one opening somewhere else. And both Patrick and I had felt like we would ultimately end up back in Nigeria. I say back in Nigeria because we had spent some time there in 1999 before even going to Belize. But we felt like Belize in many ways was preparation for Nigeria, which it ended up being. Mm-hmm. So
cool.
A little discouraging to be kicked out of the village that you lived in, that you'd invested in. But at the same time, we were trusting the Lord through that process.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Go ahead.
And that's when 2007, after you got kicked out, is when you came to Grace and Truth. And then we were able to support and walk alongside you when you went to Nigeria. Right? And what was that length of time there quickly between when you got back from Belize and when you launched into Nigeria? Give me an idea of what that was like in terms of time frame.
I believe that was only about 8 months.
8 months, okay.
We had a quick turnaround.
Oh, man. That is...
And how do you find where you're going in Nigeria?
Yeah.
Like all of that in like 8 months, that seems impossible. So like you did, because I know you didn't just spin a globe and be like, or point on the map on Nigeria and just be like,
Nigeria, the most populated country in Nigeria, in Africa.
Yeah.
We, of course, as I just mentioned, had been in Nigeria in the late 90s. Patrick had spent about 2.5 years there. I'd been there for about 6 months.
For a while longer you had.
When we first started working together. And so we had this idea. We'd been to Nigeria, first of all. We had a general idea of the city that we would base out of because we knew that area. But in terms of where we ended up, we pulled out a map and we looked at it and said, there's this huge area that there's not many villages or not many village names listed. There's not many roads going here, but we know there's people here because, again, Nigeria is the most populated country in Africa. And so we know there's people. We know this is probably people that haven't been reached with the gospel. And so we had a 1956 Willys pickup truck, which we started off with in Nigeria. And we just began driving dirt roads that weren't on the map. And sometimes they would peter out into nothing. Sometimes they would end up in villages. And when we came off a particular mountain, I think we spent probably about 6 months taking these excursions out from the city, just following different roads and trying to find our place on the map. We came off of a mountain down into a valley, and everything just kind of opened up. And there was the village that we ended up settling in, and then we realized, because of the time of year, we were passing a lot of the Fulani, the nomadic people. And so we said, this is a major trade route. And from our conversations, these people have not had much missionary work. And so
what's the first, you get into the spot where you've kind of decided that you're going to settle down, like What's one of the first conversations that you have locally? Like that's something that like goes through my mind. It's like I'm thinking of like the first time I try to talk to somebody, and I'm like, so like walk us through that.
Just like that.
Yeah. Okay. There it is. So yeah.
You nailed it.
What is that? Those initial conversations like, especially when you don't know the language.
Yeah, and that was before I was proficient in Hausa, and we had a friend of ours named Gideon. And he was interpreting for us.
Okay, gotcha.
He was traveling with us, and when we got to this particular area, he was like, "Wow, this is a very primitive area." And he had seen a lot of remote places in Nigeria, but he could tell this area was unique. And basically, we found the chief of the village, and I say chief, so you picture maybe somebody sitting on a throne with regalia on, but this is, you wouldn't know him from anybody else other than he's the recognized leader of the village. We found him, went to his house. We were sitting around eating peanuts with him, which is something they grow in the area and something they bring out for guests, and just trying to explain to him who we were, what our intentions were. He knew about missionaries. He understood the concept. And at that point, we were just saying, we're looking for a village that will give us some land to build a house on and to farm and to be able to use it as a place to benefit you as a village. And we were hoping that we could sell it, that he would receive that. And everybody was very receptive. I think in most places that we went and presented what we were there to do, but this village in particular, they seemed to be more excited. They almost immediately stood up, and the chief and the elders began walking us across some land that they said, "This is available. We'll give this to you. There's a farm here. We'll make that person move." So,
You're like, whoa.
hopefully, I think I knew who that was, and he ended up being a friend. So
Okay, good.
It worked out. But it was 9 acres, and they were like, "You can settle right here." There was the Fulani trade route, going right beside it. We were adjacent to the village. Beautiful area, a needy area in terms of the spiritual needs and otherwise, and so it just felt right.
So they gave you 9 acres. Boom, here you are. Gotcha.
That doesn't happen around here.
That's a pretty good first conversation there, Eric. You had a good question.
Yeah, it's like,
That's a pretty good first conversation.
You guys, I'm like wondering how I could get a single word out, and you had an interpreter. That's great. It's like, but the Lord was definitely with you guys for that.
And Gideon
that
was
initial.
with you throughout your time in Nigeria.
He was. He traveled with us quite a bit. He didn't live in the village.
No, I
but
knew that.
He did. He did live in the city where we would go to resupply about every 6 to 8 weeks, and so we stayed in contact with him. When you're in Nigeria, you're doing your grocery shopping, your supply shopping, even in the city. What we could probably do in a day here would take 4 or 5 days there, just because everything is so spread out. And if you need cement, you have to go to one particular shop on this side of town. If you need PVC pipe, you have to go to another shop on the other side of town.
Right, there's not a Home Depot.
That's right. Yeah. They might all be in the same neighborhood, but everybody sells their own particular thing, even with shopping for food in many ways. And so it would take us a week just to resupply, get ready to go back to the village. But Gideon was our right-hand man. He would help us navigate a lot of that.
Yeah, gotcha.
He ended up
Did it get a little faster?
close
Does
friend.
that kind of stuff get a little faster during your time there, or is it just like always took forever?
I learned where to go to get the things that I needed, but it would always take a long time because they're not a fast-paced society, and so you do take the time to converse with the shop owner, and you do force yourself to slow down, and you get to somewhere and realize they don't have what you need, and you're going to have to wait on it. And maybe that's them sending somebody to go get it, and you wait for an hour before they come back, or maybe that's come back tomorrow, maybe we'll have it.
Yeah.
And so you just never really knew.
Yeah.
But it was definitely
So back
day
to
day.
one of our earlier episodes about enjoy the journey, not just the destination. Hey, case in point here, you better learn to enjoy that journey and not just the final result, huh?
That's right. And
That,
so
is
much
that one thing that you've had to learn, and I'm sure, and practice on the mission field.
Definitely. I mean, so much of ministry takes place just in those day-to-day interactions where if you're not slowing down enough to be present in the moment and be present with those around you, you're going to miss so much of what would be there otherwise. If you're just hyper-focused and I've got a goal that I'm going to reach and I'm going to get this done and I'm going to do it like an American, you're probably going to miss most of your ministry opportunities. But if you're in a society where everything is based on relationships, then you have to slow down.
I like that.
Imagine you didn't put on a lot of conferences down there.
I did not.
Chris asked if he put on a lot of conferences. Yeah, I forgot. In case y'all didn't hear that.
Your conference was every day.
I was gonna say,
shopping.
yeah,
Yeah.
one-on-one conferences. It was.
Well, Jeff, you have such a rich, you and Patrick both just have such a rich experience and across cultures, internationally. And then you end up in Macon, Mississippi, which is like completely different from anywhere else you've been. And we probably won't spend too much time on that today, but in what, I think I'd like to kind of finish up this segment if I could with this question. And that is, how did Belize and Nigeria prepare you for Macon, Mississippi?
God has a sense of humor. That is a question that I'm still pondering. But Macon, Mississippi, and maybe this will be the simplest way to answer that, in 2016 was declared the poorest city in America. And that's according to the national poverty rate, median household income. And so there are some very, very real and critical economic needs in Macon, and along with that, a lot of spiritual needs. And so much of what we saw in Nigeria in particular was multi-generational poverty. And in many ways, that's the same wherever you go. And so a lot of what I've discovered in Macon, a lot of the environment that the young people are growing up in is very similar to what even people in an agrarian culture growing up in a farming village where they're making less than $1 a day, a very similar environment. So the needs are very much the same, and people are people wherever you go. And so I would say just being on the mission field prepared me to come to a mission field much closer to where I grew up here in Birmingham, but just as much of a ministry opportunity.
And one thing that I know from knowing your story, and maybe this will give us an opportunity to head into what we hope would be another episode, would be this one, is you were voted out of Belize, and Nigeria, while it was different, was also, you weren't given many options about whether you should stay in Nigeria or not. And there's a whole story behind all that, which I know we want to hear.
But I think what's interesting about that to me is that, like, sometimes when the Lord's working like that, it's almost like he needs you to go. So if he needs you to go somewhere else, it's is it like in that scenario as hurtful as leaving may feel, like, is it sometimes just like if the Lord slams the door, then it's like, well, at least the door is slammed and not cracked for me to try to make a decision in my own strength, or something like that. Is the finality helpful at all?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just it being definitive.
Right.
You know the door is closed. You worded it well. It's painful. You don't necessarily want to leave. I didn't envision leaving. At least not Nigeria. That was not on the cards at all. But through the circumstances, the Lord made that very clear. And so there's peace in that, in the midst of the disappointment.
Well, we definitely want to get to that story about why you you and Patrick ended up leaving Nigeria. So we're going to have you stick around, and I hope that everybody will come back. For you, it will be for you all out there, it will be next week. For us, it's going to be right now. We want to get started on an incredible story that Jeff is going to tell us of, as it led up to their exit from Nigeria. And we're going to get into that real quick. But thanks so much for kicking off this discussion with us. And as you started talking about y'all's move to Macon or all that kind of thing, I was really disappointed about wrapping this up, because we could probably go for at least another episode or two just on all the stuff that the Lord is doing here stateside with you guys too. But some other time we'll jump into that. But for now, for Derek and Steve, Chris behind the cameras, and our special guest, Jeff Shelnutt. My name is Eric, and this has been Preacher in the Hat. We'll see you next week.